Today, we are so thrilled to have Sarah joining us. She's going to be speaking with us today about neurodivergence, trauma, and somatic experiencing. We don't have time for Q&A today. So if you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to send those to the individuals that say tech at the end of their name, and we'll be happy to ask Sarah. But we won't have time for general Q&A. If you find anything that's like, oh, so this is so amazing, I want to have more of this conversation, please feel free to send us an email and we can ask Sarah to come back for more conversation around this topic. As a reminder, you will receive a link for the recording of this webinar within the next week or so. And we do have closed captions turned on. So to find that, you click on the three little buttons and you'll see the option to turn on closed caption. So that's available to you as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And thanks so much for the warm welcome. I'm just going to pull my slide deck here so we can get going and we'll get started. So thanks, everyone. We had such a high number of registrations for this webinar, and I'm not surprised because the topic is such a really important one and one that's really near and dear to my heart. And so I really wanted to just say thank you all for being willing to be here and taking this information. I am Sarah Schlote or Sarah Schlote, depending on your language of origin. I'll go by either one. I am a bilingual psychotherapist in private practice in Canada, and I am on the territory, traditional territory and current territory of the Secwepemc people, Tsilhqot'in Nation, and other Indigenous peoples on the west coast of Canada. And my pronouns are she, her, hers, or elle en français. And I am an SEP and trained in a bunch of other trauma modalities and approaches. And I'm also an approved provider of personal sessions and case consults to the advanced level. And I'm really thrilled to be here for a number of reasons. One of which is that this material affects me personally, both as a neurodivergent individual, but also as a caregiver of neurodivergent kiddos and a partner of a neurodivergent person, and having had a number of neurodivergent clients and friends over the years. And so for me, it's been really important to be able to convey some of this material to you all today, because there is so much misunderstanding related to neurodivergence. So my goals for today are going to be really to look a little bit at a more neurodivergent affirming lens on trauma and autism specifically. There's more to neurodivergence than just those categories, but I'm going to, for the purposes of our presentation, narrow the focus a little bit. As was mentioned earlier, because of the sheer number of people who have come, we can't really open it up to questions in the way we typically do, or that I like to do. So if you have a question, please contact one of the hosts and they will message me, and I'll do my best to address questions where we have time and capacity. The recording will be made available in the week following this webinar. And in order to address the need to make material accessible, we are having this material available for free on the website. So that way there's no barriers to access, which is really essential. And your donations allow us to really support this material being provided free of charge. So if you have any desire or impulse to donate to this cause of making some material accessible, please feel free to check out traumahealing.org/give. And we'll go from there. Because I'm a multiple neurodivergent person, I may get into what we call info dumping, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today. And so when I get into info dump, I can get into a little bit of a flow state where it can be where I feel regulated and in my most capable space or self, but that particular state may not resonate or reflect your nervous system experience or your needs. And so the value of having this be recorded is that while I can attend to my pacing as best as possible, at the same time, if you find that I'm going too quickly or you missed something, you have the advantage of being able to go back through and watch it and slow it down and titrate it based on what works for your own learning and your own capacity and nervous system state. And with that said, the focus for today is that I want to bring more of a neurodivergent awareness or affirming perspective to those of us in the SE community who are SE students or SEPs or assistants, approved providers or faculty members. Because it's something that isn't really built into the SE curriculum. And there's so many things that are not there because there's just so much we could cover. And for me, it's really, really important to speak to some of these specialty areas where possible. And while neurodivergence is touched on by some faculty, it's not always touched on. And so I think it's important to have space for this. So my intended audience for today is SE students and SEPs. However, I recognize that there may be other people in the audience here today who are not necessarily trained or training in the SE model. So there may be some slides or some content or some terminology that I will share or talk about that may be beyond your personal awareness or scope, and just be aware that that's going to be expected. And that's, if you have any further questions, certainly you can reach out to an SEP or an SE faculty member if you have any questions about those things, or if you're interested in becoming a client of SE, an SEP would be more than happy to explain some of these concepts if that's the case. So that would be my intention for today with this webinar. So to start us off, and some of this will be review for some of you, and some of this will be newer. And so see if you can sit with a beginner's mind as we approach this material with curiosity. So neurodiversity, just as a little bit of founding terminology, neurodiversity refers to variations in brain function. And the neurodiversity movement came about as a result of wanting to promote the idea that different brain functions or autonomic presentations are normal and are part of a normal distribution in the population and are not necessarily evidence of deficit or disorder. And so I want to come at it a little bit from this perspective, not that there won't be difficulties or challenges, but that variations are not necessarily some sort of moral judgment like, oh, like you're this or you're that, as we often see with current perspectives that take a more pathologizing approach. So the neurodiversity movement implies this idea that there are lots of variations that are possible and that are quite normal. And those include what we might call neurotypical. And for lack of a better term or a better description, I would describe neurotypical as someone whose executive functioning or way of processing sensory input or information and their behavior are considered the norm within a given population. And so what that looks like might vary, but for the most part, there will be some sort of typical that is, and there's variations in individual differences, of course, but there's going to be some sort of societal standard that is held as the benchmark. And that's not necessarily always accurate or helpful, but this can be what happens. So I'll use the terms neurotypical or NT in this presentation. And then there's neurodivergent. So neurodivergent would be someone whose functioning in those different areas might differ from what might be considered the norm. And so these terms are not used or intended as judgmental or critical or anything like that. It's just more about helping to recognize that there can be these differences. And both of those will make up what we call neurodiversity. So a person is not neurodiverse. the population can be neurodiverse, but an individual would either be neurotypical or neurodivergent, depending on where they happen to fall within that diversity. So you sometimes hear people say, oh, neurodiverse individuals, and that is a little bit complex or confusing. So usually neurodiversity refers to a population as opposed to an individual or variation within the population. And when we talk about neurodivergence, there's a lot of examples of what that means. So just to contextualize and position ourselves for this presentation, I'm really looking very specifically at autism and ADHD, or what is affectionately known as ADHD, as for people who have both. And of course, there are other forms of neurodivergence that exist. And so there are a few examples listed here, but there are other examples as well. Some lists of neurodivergence are really broad and include things like acquired neurodivergence, like via traumatic brain injury, for instance, Tourette syndrome or various tics, people with communication disorders of various kinds, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, OCD, PTSD and complex PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, Down syndrome, and so on and so forth. And so neurodivergence refers to these differences in neurology or functionality or autonomic functionality compared to what we might consider the norm. And then, of course, you might push back and say, well, is there even a normal anyway? But while that could be true, there still tends to be assumptions that we make and biases that we have that are based on some sort of definition of what we might consider a yardstick. And that yardstick is often based on some sort of typical of some kind. And so for our purposes, we're going to work off of that assumption. So what I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on today is autism and ADHD. And not to exclude others, but just for the focus of time. And also because those are the categories that I'm most familiar with personally and professionally. So before we get into this idea of neurodivergent affirming perspectives and how we can come at this from this perspective within SE and considerations on adapting SE, it's important to recognize that currently autism and ADHD are listed in the DSM-5 TR, which is the most recent text revision, as well as the ICD. I think it's 11 now that we're at internationally for the ICD. They're considered to be disorders. And so, and what I've got here on the next few slides, and I'm not expecting you all to read it, but I wanted to put it up just as accessible information around the fact that autism and ADHD are both diagnosed based on a pathology-based model currently. And so with autism, just as an overview for those of you who may be less familiar with it, it's looking at persistent deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts, so work, home, school, social, etc. And that can include things like deficits in reciprocity in social relationships or in sharing of emotional content. A common example is difficulty with back and forth conversation, reduced affect, difficulty or initiating or responding in social interactions, and so on. Difficulty with verbal and nonverbal communication, what they're calling abnormalities in eye contact, differences in body language, differences with gestures, lack of facial expression, and so on. And challenges with maintaining and understanding relationships in social contexts, as well as difficulty with engaging in certain kinds of play. And again, this is coming from the disorder model, right? So I'm just going to start this off as context. With autism, there's also this idea of restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities, whether we see stereotypical or repetitive movements, use of objects or speech, sometimes called stimming, insistence on sameness or inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized type behavior, highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, according to the DSM. You can start to see how this is, and you may notice as I'm reading these, a response in yourselves, right? There may be a SIBAM experience for you or activation happening as you're listening to this, or even possibly more of a freeze type response as you're reading this. So just notice your own internal response as you're hearing or reading some of these pieces around autism as a disorder. And there can also be hyper or hypo reactivity to environmental or sensory cues. And they want to look at the severity. And the severity is based on impairments in these different categories. And the symptoms need to be present in early life, but may only manifest later when someone's capacity or management strategy or ability to mask their symptoms gets exceeded. So there's some challenges with obviously diagnosis, is that if someone learned to mask very early on, it might not show up until later, but then the diagnosis requires the early symptoms to be present. So it makes it a bit tricky. There needs to be clinically significant impairment. And again, this is where things start to get a little bit hairy, and I'll come back to this. And the disturbances are not better explained by some sort of intellectual disability or developmental delay of some kind, okay? And the severity levels for autism currently are listed as levels 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 would be requiring support, where there is significant interference of functioning, substantial support, or very substantial support with extreme difficulty. So the ranges of severity range from significant to severe, and that is, or extreme rather. And that's sort of how autism is diagnosed within the DSM. ADHD is a little different. They often co-occur, and within families, there's a really strong genetic or heritable feature to both ADHD and autism. And the higher likelihood, if there's a sibling with one or the other, there's a really high likelihood that other siblings will also have one or the other as well. And so with ADHD, we're going to either see persistent patterns of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity. And so there's going to be either one or the other or both. And so with inattention, here are some examples of what that can look like. And so not paying attention to details, making careless mistakes, difficulty with sustained attention, not always seeming to listen when spoken to directly, difficulty with tasks, activities, following through on instructions, can be patterns of avoidance, might lose things, easily distracted, can be forgetful, etc. With hyperactivity or impulsivity, we might see a little bit more of fidgeting, squirming, a lot of physical stimming or behavioral stimming as well, or displacement behavior, difficulty with settling, running around or climbing, a lot of physical movement and activity, difficulty with regulation, often being on the go, or I like the definition or the description here, driven by a motor. So being still can be challenging. Can be a lot of excessive verbalizing or a lot of talking, can also talk at a younger age and be really verbal at a very young age, and can also have difficulty with navigating social communication, tendency to jump in or what's the word? Interrupt and not quite know where to slide in conversation. And difficulty waiting their turn and so on and so forth. And here again, symptoms need to be present at a younger age in more than one setting, and not explained by something else, right? Could be better, not explained by a mood disorder or anxiety disorder or some other such thing. And with ADHD, you want to specify if it's inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, or both, as in combined, or if it's in remission. And here's what's really interesting, and I want to point this out because this is where I'm now going to move away from the diagnostic sort of criteria of these two categories, because that's just for context. With severity with ADHD, the DSM allows for mild, moderate, and severe, which is really interesting. So few, if any, symptoms in excess of those required to make the diagnosis of present, right? And only minor functional impairments is the low range of the threshold for ADHD. And that wasn't the case for autism. So I'm going to come back around to that because that is part of why we want to shift to a more neurodivergent affirming model. So when you're you're hearing these sort of descriptions from this medical model perspective on these two categories of neurodivergence, you may again have noticed certain things come up for you. And so being curious about that, I'm going to take some time to talk a little bit about what might be coming up that explains the SIDAM experience you may be having, the sensations, any images, behaviors, affect, or meaning making that might be emerging in relation to what we've just gone over. And it's really important to come at this from this perspective. So with diagnostic criteria around autism and ADHD, the criteria are limiting and can be confusing. So there can be circular logic with some of the criteria. One example of which that I gave was, you need to have shown it in childhood, but sometimes it only shows up later because you may have been, masking it or having some sort of coping mechanism, and therefore it only shows up later in life, as in late diagnosed individuals. There's many, many of those. And some people don't get their late diagnosis because they weren't showing signs at younger ages because of how that diagnostic criteria is indicated. So, so there can be some of that circular stuff going on. And there's other ones as well. The second article cited there, the 2022 article, has a really long list of challenges with the current ADHD diagnostic criteria and how problematic it can be. Singer goes over some of the ones around autism. So one of the other challenges, of course, is that when reading some of those diagnostic criteria, it sort of lends itself to the stereotypes of autism and ADHD, doesn't it? So and that stereotypical quality of it really reflects that autism is diagnosed in cisgendered boys 4 times more often than in cisgendered girls earlier in childhood. And it's essential to know that early studies on autism and the early criteria and even the current criteria were really established based on research related to cis boys and especially white cis boys. So we're seeing very particular representation. And there can be an underrepresentation of autistic females, especially those with higher IQ. So there can be this assumption that autism is equated with lower IQ, developmental disorder or delay, intellectual delay, and so on. And that's not always the case. And so there can be a conflation of some of these categories. And what's interesting is, and not surprising, autistic females with average IQ often have increased social behavior compared to males, as well as higher language ability, which makes them less likely to be diagnosed or caught, so to speak, or identified, or their discovery comes later in life. And often autistic females will have fewer repetitive behaviors as well. And what's also really fascinating, of course, is that there is a high correlation between autism and being trans or gender diverse, non-binary, et cetera. There are higher rates of autism and autistic traits within that community, which is something that is sometimes referred to as audi-queer, for instance, and how there's going to be particular things there related to acknowledgement or discovery or identification that are going to be important to recognize. And this also true, and I didn't have this listed here because I didn't have a chance to grab the article before we began today, but there's also obviously going to be autism presenting in different cultural populations, such as the Black community, autism showing up in the Black community, what does that look like? And Black experiences of autism are also going to be different from, say, white experiences of autism. So there's going to be presentation challenges that make the current diagnostic criteria a little bit tricky. ADHD is similar, more commonly diagnosed in males versus females as well for similar reasons. Early studies more based on cisgendered boy presentations of ADHD. The other challenge that you may have caught when reading through or hearing me read through the diagnostic criteria is that neurotypical, so to speak, is the yardstick for normal. And so an example will be that, and you probably saw it, especially with the autism one, where it was, I forget how they said it, like deficiencies in social emotional behavior, difficulty with reciprocity, difficulty with eye language, or eye communication rather, The eye language, the language of using our eyes, for instance, is what I meant by that. And what's fascinating is that current research of looking at communication between neurodivergent people shows that there aren't often these deficits. You know, neurodivergent people in communication often understand each other quite well. You know, they, imagine the lack of imaginary play, or the different types of play that neurodivergent people engage in are perfectly comfortable forms of play with other neurodivergent people. Difficulty with eye contact between a neurodivergent and a neurotypical person doesn't really come up as an issue in communication between neurodivergent folks. So it's interesting, because what is considered deviant or pathology is based upon a yardstick that may not match the total population. Right. And it's fascinating also because from a cultural competency perspective, there is, we're very, very good, I think, usually about being culturally competent around, oh, well, this culture doesn't use eye contact, that, not having your eyes on the other person is a sign of deference or respect. And so, we want to be respectful of eye language or eye norms around eye contact. But that's not necessarily always respected with regards to neurodivergent social culture, for instance, or even neurodivergent trauma, which we'll get into. And so that isn't really embedded within the diagnostic criteria. It's just lack of eye contact is viewed as a problem or evidence of an issue. And of course, there's scaling issues as well. So I had hinted to that earlier. The scaling for ADHD goes from mild to severe in terms of impairment or difficulty functioning or what have you. The severity scaling for autism begins at significant. So mild and moderate, people with mild and moderate traits of autism, for instance, if we could call it that, don't often meet the criteria anymore. There's now exclusion around those who have mild to moderate autism traits, for instance, or the former language around high functioning, for instance, which is sort of discouraged language because high functioning can just be a really good evidence of a management strategy of masking and actually hides difficulty, right? But the former category of high functioning, or what we might call low support need, that sometimes doesn't always reach or result in a diagnosis of autism. And so what ends up happening is that the criteria of autism are really focused on autistic people in distress, right? As opposed to the full range versus ADHD, where the mild category will absolutely be diagnosable. And so what ends up happening is that there could be a limiting of access to really important supports and resources, many of which require an autism diagnosis to receive, although that treatment is often primarily behavioral, in order to try to shape or eliminate autistic traits or behavior to help them to fit into more of a neurotypical mold of society. And the interesting result of this, and I don't know how intentional or not this is the result is basically no more autism, right? By excluding those who are mild to moderate and not calling them autistic, they're no longer considered autistic. And by only scaling it from severe or significant to severe, and then those folks are in distress, and the goal of those is to get them identified, to get them into some sort of behavior therapy, to get them to stop having some of these challenges. The focus on a cure for autism means that we're going to get rid of autism, which is this very interesting perspective that implies that autism is this thing to eradicate, which ADHD doesn't have to the same degree. So even within the neurodivergent family, ADHD is sometimes more commonly socially acceptable than being autistic. And this is a real challenge because some of the early methodology used in treating autism, ABA or applied behavior analysis or behavior shaping to try to induce certain behaviors versus others. The creator of that was known for having very harsh perspectives around autistic people, as in viewing them as non-persons, for instance, and how do we make them into persons? And so there can be this undercurrent of eugenics or eradication of or genocide of the autistic population. similar to how we see with the Down syndrome individuals in certain countries, where there can be this focus on genetic testing in order to abort pregnancies to eradicate Down syndrome, right? So there is this extra flavor of feeling unsafe in the world that many autistic people carry because of this implied thing around you're not okay, you're not welcome here, right? Which we see in some of these subtle things, which is why I wanted to bring up some of the diagnostic criteria, because there's these embedded pieces that are there that are, unless you don't notice them, you might miss them. And so the challenge, of course, is that there's a fair amount of ableism through which we perceive neurodivergence. And if I think about ableism as one of the isms, right, there's racism and ageism and, lots of different forms of privilege, colonialism, right? There's so many forms of privilege. I'm not going to get into them again. We're strapped for time. You can certainly look this up. But ableism is one that we don't talk about a lot or enough, especially within the SE community. And so there can be a double standard in society where if you are not able-bodied or of able mind, so to speak, that you're a second-class citizen, and there's less of a desire to place resources and invest in supports for you if that's the case. And there is a lot of connections from an intersectional perspective, where there's going to be, with ableism, there can be racism embedded in that, sexism embedded in that, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism embedded in this. With ableism, it's about, are you fitting this model in order to fit into society as it currently exists? And if you don't, then you're a drain. And we see this a lot with autism and ADHD. What is disabling often about some of these conditions, is it necessarily the condition itself, or is it the condition of society that makes the individual who's autistic or an ADHDer have difficulty, right? Is it the lack of accommodation? Is it the fact that society is ableist and based on a neurotypical norm that is disabling, as opposed to the conditions themselves? And it's a focus shift. So we want to really be mindful of that with this particular category, especially with these other layers within that, about especially with the connections of neurodivergence with the LGBTQ community, within racialized communities, and other communities as well. So this is about how we're expected to behave, and there can be challenges within that. Other pieces related to this too that can color our perspective as practitioners is this issue of diagnostic overshadowing. So diagnostic overshadowing is when the thing that we think it is actually something else, but we're calling it this other thing. So one example within the autistic community is this idea that autistic people lack empathy. Right. And this comes out of early theories around autism, that autism involves a lack of theory of mind, as in an autistic person can't put themselves in the shoes of another person, understand what rationales make them tick, those kinds of ideas, can't mentalize about others, basically. And there's some interesting material coming out now around this idea of, well, is that not diagnostic overshadowing, right? Is it that autistic people all lack empathy? Is that a sign of actually being overwhelmed? When I'm overwhelmed, either because of sensory input or trauma, either developmental trauma, neurodivergent trauma, because of being a neurodivergent person in an ableist world, is it because of that I lack empathy? Because I'm just so emotionally drained of all the emotional labor I have to do to be in the world that I have a hard time being empathetic? Is that why? Right? Or is it just autistics lack empathy? Right? So is the issue the autism, or is it actually autonomic overwhelm, trauma, compassion fatigue, so to speak, by the autistic person, right? So we want to kind of expand a little bit beyond this idea. There can also be, is the lack of empathy and difficulty with theory of mind because of actually a different issue, like a developmental delay or an intellectual disability, and it's not the autism, right? So what is the thing, right? So the overshadowing is that we're attributing something to one category, but in reality, it's evidence of another category. And then the first category ends up being misunderstood as a result. Or is it evidence of different kinds of empathy, right? With there can be variations in how empathy is experienced by neurodivergent individuals and expressed by neurodivergent individuals. And is it just not recognized because the person who's saying autistics lack empathy is neurotypical and doesn't recognize those differences, right? So there's these nuances we really, really want to understand. And this reflects something that's called the double empathy problem within the neurodivergent community, which is this idea that if you look at the diagnostic criteria for something like autism, and it's, lacking empathy, right? We saw that, like, difficulty with social, emotional reciprocity in relationship, difficulty with being able to communicate in ways that are understandable, or, and again, neurodivergent to neurodivergent often communicate quite well with each other and understand each other quite well. But when it's neurotypical to neurodivergent, is really where we start to see this double empathy problem. Someone's audio seems to be on. So hosts, if you can check just to make sure everyone is muted, that would be great. So with the double empathy problem, it's the double standard around empathy. So I, as a neurodivergent person, apparently have issues because I have difficulty with empathizing with you, but why is there no emphasis on a neurotypical person? Where's the pathology of that? The neurotypical person isn't necessarily aware of what is going on for the neurodivergent person. The expectation and the onus is placed on the neurodivergent person to shift their behavior to be more understandable to the neurotypical person. I need to fit that mold. Why is the reverse also not happening? Why is there not the same effort in reverse to understand what is typical for the neurodivergent person and how to communicate in ways that will match the neurodivergent model, right? And so it's a very unidirectional kind of thing. And so this all contributes to diagnostic overshadowing. And it also speaks to a lack of attention to the conditions. And with SE, we're really in the service of setting these conditions, right? We start off with the proxemics. How's this distance? What's it like being here? We focus a lot on attunement, right? And being able to really titrate and bring our attention to the subtleties and the story of the body beneath the verbal story. Like, we're all about this relational attunement and the conditions that are required for something to move through, right? When we feel held, we can let go what got in the way, what supported trauma to happen, and what supports trauma to renegotiate. That's all about setting conditions and how we hold the space. And with diagnosis for ADHD and autism, there's a lack of attention to the conditions. Is this idea, again, of lack of empathy actually evidence of overwhelming trauma? And then what are we doing to shift the conditions to support less compassion fatigue, right? Less overwhelm, less trauma for a neurodivergent person. And the quote that's on the screen here, I find is very helpful. Society doesn't really make untraumatized autistics, which I think is a very interesting and controversial, but certainly eye-opening and provoking perspective. And it really speaks to this particular cluster of issues with diagnosis. And this is part of it as well, is that there are so many commonalities and what we might call over and under couplings between autism, ADHD, and trauma, that it can be challenging to sift and tease these apart. There's a lot of similarities between autism and ADHD that go well beyond the diagnostic categories. So you'll see the diagnostic categories, they seem very different as classifications, and yet there's more to autism and ADHD than just what those diagnostic categories describe. And there's a lot of overlap with trauma. And so we'll see things like difficulties with executive functioning, memory, attention, planning, organization of thought. That kind of stuff can be challenged with all three categories. There can be dysregulation and overwhelm with all three categories, time perception issues with all three categories, a tendency to hyperfocus, whether that hyperfocus is part of an autism or ADHD trait, or it's the hyperfixation of trauma on where are the threats, where are the exits. There can be a hyperfixation there as well. They're different in tone, certainly, but that fixation of attention can happen in all three. A pattern of avoidance, we'll see something called pervasive demand avoidance, or perhaps a persistent drive for autonomy with autism and ADHD that can occur with neurodivergence. There can be avoidance in trauma as well around extra demands or material related to trauma, activating triggers, and so on. We'll see differences in interoception in all three categories, sensitivity to rejection because of a tendency to be to have insecure attachment because of either the insecure attachment occurring as a result of being misunderstood because of neurodivergence, or it not being caught, or the trauma is led to insecure attachment, and how these feed each other, and a concern around being rejected or misunderstood that can occur in all three. Attention to pattern and details. Attention to detail can be a really strong feature of ADHD for certain things. Autism, attention to patterns, and trauma, you can have that as a result of hypervigilance in order to keep yourself safe. And so it can occur in all three. And there's, again, many comorbidities with the three categories as well. And so there's a great link here by a colleague of mine named Janae Elizabeth, and they have a really great website called traumageek.com. Feel free to follow them on social media. They are a really cool individual with a lot of really great materials, and they have a really great blog post on the difference between autistic traits and autistic trauma as one example. And some of that will potentially apply to other forms of neurodivergence as well. So do feel free to go and have a look. It's a great little post. Other folks have also attempted to show the overlaps between things like PTSD and autism, or ADHD and PTSD. Dr. Megan Neff has Neurodivergent Insights. I put the website there. If you go to her website, you will see a whole bunch of different overlapping diagrams like these, and you can actually either download them or purchase them if you want to support her work. So please feel free to go and have a look. And it's also really helpful to recognize that with autism and ADHD, there's overlap with giftedness in some cases, and there can be overlapping traits here. And I'm obviously not going to take the time to go through all of these because there's so many, but it is really helpful to recognize that there's that as well, and to not make assumptions. And this is part of the challenge, I think, sometimes with autism and ADHD, is that there can be correlation with giftedness, but even with giftedness, there are difficulties as well. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. So the question currently within the neurodivergent community and within the neurodiversity movement, and I want to encourage us all to think about as SE folks, is what would neurodivergent wellness look and feel like? If we're not coming from this idea that neurodivergence is automatically pathology, what would it look and feel like to have a non-traumatized autistic person who might no longer meet some of the criteria to get their autism diagnosis, right? Because the diagnosis is really from significant to severe. We're not seeing mild to moderate. And it's not that you can't have significant need for support and be autistic. You can still have that, but also not be a traumatized autistic. And what would that look like? Those things have become, again, there's this diagnostic overshadowing, right? So what is it? What would it be like? What would it feel like? What would be the sensations of the body or the physiology of a neurodivergent individual who actually feels safe in the world? How are we setting different conditions for individuals in this population, which involves addressing what feels unsafe in the world for this population, addressing the ableism that this population feels on a regular basis, avoiding black and white perspectives that are, they're all this or they're all that. We want to see the whole person, right? So that means that there might be challenges and there may be strengths, and there may be, like some people will say, blessings and curses to being neurodivergent. And how do we start to hold the space for all of that? And how do we start to hold the space for the phenomenology of neurodivergence, not just the limited diagnostic criteria? And just hosts, we've got, I think some new people who have joined have, I don't know how it is, but we've got a few people who are drawing on the screen. We've got some really fun blue lines that are showing up. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. I know that's typical of the whiteboard feature. I'm not sure how come people are able to draw on slides and outside of whiteboard. So perhaps you can check the back end about what feature is enabled currently. So this idea of phenomenology of autism or phenomenology of ADHD is different from the diagnostic criteria of ADHD and autism. And that's one of the big challenges that we see. So can we be curious about what goes beyond the phenomenal or beyond the diagnosis, right? There's phenomenology to these things that are broader. And so as you can see, I don't know if I can actually remove these. Nope, I can't. So we will have to live with these lovely blue stripes on my screen for now. I apologize. Somebody has done a really lovely painting job of adding some sweet touches to my slides. So the phenomenology and the lived experience of neurodivergence is one to be really curious about. And so it's really essential to listen to and amplify neurodivergent voices from their perspective, because their neuroception, their interoception, their felt sense is going to automatically be different from what we might consider the norm, and may not be the same as trauma. And so if we come into supporting this population and misunderstand or misinterpret the things that we're picking up on in their phenomenology, because SE is a phenomenological approach, and we're working with the how and the what, if we're interpreting all of this as evidence of trauma, which it could very well be, because there is certainly trauma experienced by neurodivergent people by virtue of simply living in an ableist and, socially unjust society. We're going to have that, as well as all the other traumas that can occur, of course. But is it that? Is it trauma, or is it neurodivergent trait that we're actually picking up on? Right? And differences may not be a sign of trauma, but may be a sign of just differences because of this neurodivergence. We want to recognize the relational and medical trauma that this population often and routinely experiences. There can be a fair amount of freeze and appease that occurs for this population, where safe social engagement was not possible. There's different ways of communicating that are quite normal for a neurodivergent person that a neurotypical therapist or practitioner might see as deviant because of this, pathology model, but in reality works quite well within neurodivergent to neurodivergent communication. So we want to recognize that freeze and appease, or functional freeze and appease, can be a very big feature of some neurodivergent folks who might show up for SE. And that there's, in this population, as with many and most populations that are marginalized, a greater risk of abuse, being exploited, being discriminated against, marginalized, gaslit, crazy made, and blame shifted. So gaslighting is this idea of making someone question their notion of reality. And that usually can result in, or be as a result of, crazy making. So making someone doubt their reality. No, that's not too, like a sensory is often a certain thing. No, that's not painful. That shouldn't be painful, right? Or no, that's not too bright. Or no, it's not too cold, and not acknowledging that the sensory experience may be very different. And this category of people, autistic people specifically, there can be a tendency to presume incompetence and infantilize. And we really want to support agency for this population and presume competence, even within differences in communication, presuming competence and understanding where possible, because of this infantilization and being told what they need, what they should focus on, what they want, right? How they should be. And we see this through the main methods of therapy for this population, which are based on having this person fit into a particular mold, as opposed to helping shift the mold to be more inclusive. Forced guardianships and conservatorships of autistic people absolutely can happen, where they lose their legal right to their own decision-making ability simply because they're autistic. Even if they have really good mental capacity, it is very, very common. And losing parental and reproductive rights, not being allowed to immigrate to certain countries, et cetera, et cetera. So there can be a lot of discriminations and stacked variables faced by this population. Another thing that can happen with this population is the double binds. And you know you're neurodivergent when you're either too much or not enough for people. And that is a really, really common thing that is really a particular feature, I think, of the curse and the blessing of being neurodivergent, is there can be too many strengths, right? If there's too many strengths, too much masking, and too few support needs, you don't meet the criteria, therefore you're not neurodivergent enough to be neurodivergent. But if you have too many, the expression that comes back is often, well, you're just making excuses. We all struggle. You're not trying hard enough. We're all a little bit autistic or ADHD. And there can be this tendency to dismiss whether you are doing well or you're not doing well. And there can be a presentation that is very sometimes polarized, where you might see a lot of capacity in one area, like the illustration on the left, and a lack of capacity in the other area. And I find that these two memes really describe me to a T, right? Some people will, see me as being very competent and very intelligent, and people will say, oh yeah, you've got all these really cool superpowers. And I'm like, but you don't see the times where my brain is just in the buffering circle. Like, you don't see the times where my brain cells won't rub together because I just sit there in an experience of inertia because I'm so mentally overwhelmed by all the things that I'm picking up on. And so there can be these very big double binds faced by this population. And double binds have a particular felt sense that we start to pick up on in SE that we want to get really curious about. And from the ND perspective, we want to recognize the strengths and challenges are both there, right? So when you focus just on the superpowers, someone who may be quote unquote high functioning, again, terminology we're wanting to move away from, or the masking capacity that someone has to fit into a neurotypical society, to hide their traits in order to fit in. We see this with relational trauma in general, but it's particularly true of this population. There can be a tendency to miss some of that. We want to hold the reality that there are strengths and challenges associated with neurodivergence. It's not all pathologizing and it's not all superpowers, right? And so we see these stereotypes in the media, where autism and ADHD are portrayed in either one, and there very rarely is portrayal that is accurately representing all these aspects and pieces. So the disabilities associated with neurodivergence. So disability, first off, is not a dirty word, but get to know the person you're talking to. Disability with neurodivergence can be external or internal. And what I mean by that is, for many people, autism and ADHD has a disabling quality, and some people also get disabled status in terms of social benefits. Not that they're all that, fantastically supportive financially, but certain people go on disability because of neurodivergence, because of the intense support needs that they may have. And the question, of course, is what's disabling the neurodivergence or the conditions within the neurodivergent person is trying to survive, right? If the world is an ableist place that is built around supporting and accommodating a particular kind of person that meets a particular set of criteria or normalness, the norm is defined as neurotypical, for instance, then if you're not neurotypical, you're going to struggle more because there's a lack of accommodation. The world was not built for someone like you, right? And so is the disability the conditions, or is there actual also disability on the inside? And I would say both can be true. There are features of autism and ADHD that are internally disabling, right? That have nothing to do with the external circumstances. And just in terms of getting through a day sometimes. And you might have goals in life that you want to achieve, but some of the traits and challenges of neurodivergence and the autonomic sort of pattern or wiring that exists for neurodivergence can actually cause limitations that are internally hampering as opposed to sort of societally. So the two are there. And we also want to be careful about something that is called inspiration porn, the tendency to look at someone with a disability or, someone who's neurodivergent as, wow, you're so inspiring. You look at all you have to overcome. I feel less problematic about my stuff, right? There can be this tendency to glorify powerful inspirational stories of neurodivergent people who've had to overcome odds and view that as inspiration for me as a neurotypical person kind of idea. And then quietly go on my day, my inspiration porn cup having been filled, and no efforts made to change the systemic issues that the neurodivergent person has to overcome in the first place to be the source of your inspiration porn, right? So there's these layers in this that are really, really important to hold when we're supporting neurodivergent clients. Added to this is something called the spiky profile. And a spiky profile, and I've got the little rose diagram here, is an example of that, where a neurodivergent spectrum of traits and behaviors can change. Someone's capacity can change moment to moment or day to day. What was possible in one moment might not be possible in the next. Someone might be able to zip up their coat in the morning and need help with zipping up their coat in the afternoon. It's the same individual. And masking can further conceal presentation challenges or challenges in various areas because of needing to fit in and hide certain difficulties. And so the spikiness of the profile in terms of the strengths or the difficulties that neurodivergent people may experience can also be impacted by the degree of overwhelm they may be facing, right? Having to navigate all of this. So I might call that stimulus stacking. Some people call that trigger stacking, but it's not always a trauma trigger. It could just be sensory overwhelm, right? But if I'm overwhelmed by 80 things, external and internal, my capacity will be different. And it might look very different. And there can be this tendency to misinterpret capacity based on where they underperform or overperform, or underfunction and overfunction, to use that kind of languaging, although I know we're trying to move away from functional labels, but you understand where I'm coming from with this. And so the profile might change. And so capacity one day to be present to sensation, for instance, or track charge or activation may be different on a different day. The capacity to remember to orient, or even to, sit a particular way on the couch that brings comfort, might differ from one day to the next. My capacity to even get up out of bed may differ one day to the next. And so the capacities will vary. And just because one person on one day has difficulty and the next day is doing better isn't evidence of faking necessarily. And we see this with ableism. Wheelchair users who are occasional wheelchair users. This is beyond, obviously, the neurodivergent conversation, but it's an example that I think is helpful. Some wheelchair users only need to use their wheelchair on occasion because they might be facing pain, increased pain, chronic fatigue. They may have twisted their ankle a little bit because of some sort of hypermobility issue and need to use it a little bit more, and then go back to maybe not needing it as much. And there can be a tendency to go, well, you didn't need it here, therefore you're faking, or you just want attention, because clearly you're capable of not needing it, right? So the same thing can happen with neurodivergence as well. So before I continue, I'm just going to take a moment just to allow a bit of pause and check in with the hosts to see if there are any questions about what I've covered to date, if anything needs to be addressed or repeated because it wasn't clear. And I'll just ask the host either unmute or put it in the chat so I know to continue.
I think that the only thing I've seen so far, people are wondering if they will receive a copy of the slides.
I am happy to do that. I want to finish the the references section at the end. I have partial references completed, so I would like to complete that before sending. sending that if that's possible. So I'll do my best to have that in time for when the recording is shared, but it might be that we put it up on the website later if I'm not able to get to that in a timely manner, but I am more than happy to share it. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then we did have a question that I answered, but I think it's also a really good question for the group, which is, can you go over the difference between neuroception and interoception?
Yes, that is great. I'll actually do you one better. I will come to the differences between neuroception, interoception, and exteroception, because we've got that as well. So neuroception is a term coined by Steve Porges, and that comes from polyvagal theory and the idea that there is this capacity that we all have to detect safety, danger, or life threat. Now, this ability to do so is not unique to polyvagal theory. The term neuroception was coined by Steve Porges, but the literature has been talking about safety, danger, and threat detection for many decades. So, but the term itself refers to that. So what I like about the term neuroception is that it really isn't just about threat detection or danger detection, but it's also about noticing it assumes safety detection as well. And most of the current terminology is more focused on, like threat detection, for instance. So neuroception implies that all three are possibilities. Interoception is my ability to pick up on internal cues. So cues that are coming from the inside of me. And those cues are sometimes referred to as the felt sense. And some interoceptive cues are very much not in awareness, and some neuroceptive cues can become into awareness. So one example would be a cue that tells my nervous system to feel calm. Some of that might be very explicit, like I might notice, I might take in information and then notice a calming in my chest, or I notice my breath starts to relax, that kind of idea. I can track a shift, but there are other cues that I might not be aware of, like there might be neuropeptide changes in my gut that communicate to my autonomic nervous system that things are safe, and those changes, I might never be aware of them because they're so molecular, right? That I might not tell the changes in the neuropeptides that might indicate if I'm feeling safety or danger. But those neuropeptides will communicate with other circuitry and systems and then lead to things that I might be able to pick up on interoceptively. So both of those are interoception, but interoception, not all of it is going to be consciously available to bring attention to. Exteroception is what I'm noticing on the outside. Okay, so anything that I'm noticing sensory through my sensory intake. So hopefully that's helpful. All right, any other questions, Caroline, before I continue?
No, everything's great.
Great, awesome. I will continue. All right. So a few things to know about also, and I'm going to talk about by the end of this presentation why these next pieces are really essential from an SE perspective. So with regards to autism and ADHD, because they can often co-occur, some of these next pieces, while they were originally defined for autism, some of this will apply to some varying degrees with some ADHD folks as well, either because they might fall in that category of ADHD, as in they've got both, or they might have elements of broader neurodivergence without meeting the criteria for autism, for instance. So there's going to be, and this is what I mean by the criteria for autism and ADHD diagnosis are so limited compared to the phenomenology of autism and ADHD, that what I'm going to talk about here is some of the phenomenology around neurodivergence that doesn't feature into the diagnostic criteria, and which is why the neurodivergent community often supports self-identification or self-discovery or self-diagnosis, whichever word you prefer, because so many people who are neurodivergent get missed and don't fit the criteria because the criteria have been limited in the ways that I've discussed. And so one example of that is the phenomenology of neurodivergence just isn't part of the diagnostic criteria for some reason. So one of them is monotropism. So this is a theory that was developed by Murray and is basically this idea that interests in neurodivergent people, especially autism, tend to pull neurodivergent people more strongly than neurotypical people. And so this is focused on as an interest system, which already, if we look at it from this perspective, the diagnostic criteria of lacking interest in things, that are maybe, they should be interested in. It's like, well, who dictates what's interesting, right, to the neurodivergent person? Who created these diagnostic criteria? So there are particular interest systems that are featured with neurodivergent folks. And there can be either a desire to be interested in many things, like we see with ADHD, and have real deep dives into many things, or with autism, deeper dives in fewer things. But there can be a tendency to hyper-focus in both cases. And so, so it's not so much always that there's a deficit in attention, but sometimes the attention is sometimes with ADHD, difficult to regulate because it's all over the place, or it's that the attention is very, very focused, but sometimes it's hard to regulate it, or the attention is very focused because it's driven by the interest system. It's driven by the person's attractions and what they find fascinating, what lights them up. And so with monotropism, especially, there is often fewer interests, but more processing resources allocated to them. And so that may make it harder for someone who's neurodivergent to focus outside of their current channel. And how this links with SciBAM is absolutely fascinating. So bear with me as I get to it. So there will be this tendency to get really deep dives into hyperfocus and drive a lot of energy and attention into these areas. And hyperfocus sometimes is accompanied by what we might call info dumping. So a tendency to, well, like I'm doing with this webinar, share a lot of information. And sometimes that information sharing can happen at a really quick pace because there's so much passion and excitement for the topic, and so much awareness of all the nuances related to a topic. And that can reflect, again, the neurodivergent ability to have really good pattern recognition, detail orientation on subjects of interest. And sometimes that's the trauma. Hypervigilance is also about gathering a lot of excessive information, right? But with neurodivergence, it often can be evidence of a flow state. And flow state isn't unique to neurodivergence, but it's when we get in the zone. And when you're in the zone, there's a particular felt sense to that feels really good. And for neurodivergent folks, especially, there's a high degree of passion and joy, and it can feel very regulating to be in a flow state. It can feel predictable. There can be a felt sense of competence, and it can feel really deeply motivating. And in fact, you'll see that where someone might, not be able to get something done that requires, that isn't part of their interest system, but devote hours upon hours on this one thing and miss eating and miss going to the bathroom because they're just so drawn down the rabbit hole in this thing that they feel flow about. And in a world that's really discombobulating, these flow states are a really helpful place to live and are really resourcing, and maybe a really important source of coherence for a neurodivergent person. And they can sometimes be connected with hyperliteral thinking, the tendency to be really in this one zone. Now, monotropism is not wording that we see in the diagnostic criteria, but you could see in the diagnostic criteria difficulty with rigidity, difficulty with shifting focus, difficulty with change. Now, that sounds very pathologizing. And while that objectively may be true, when you think about it from the perspective of monotropism, it's like, oh, it takes on a bit of a different feel. Is it just that I'm rigid and inflexible? Or is there actually something else going on here? And so this is, again, the difference between the phenomenology of autism or ADHD and the diagnostic criteria for it. And Murray talks about, along with this idea of monotropism, something called autistic inertia, which is one I really, really find happens a lot for me. It's the difficulty starting, stopping, or changing direction, right? So that would be that inertia quality. And so there can be discomfort around being interrupted when you're in a flow state and being pulled out of that, or plans changing because the resources have been allocated to this stream. And so to pull resources into another stream is really challenging for autism, ADHD, and especially if you've got the two combined. It's even more challenging to shift attention out of the pathway that you're in. And so the analogy that Murray gives here is it's as if we've loaded a cart to the brim with thoughts and feelings, and then suddenly we have to steer it around a sharp corner. It's like that quote from I forget the song, but it takes a little time sometimes to turn the Titanic around, right? The Titanic has a really tiny rudder, it isn't worth a dang, right? So it's like it takes a while to get that ship to change course. And that's really reflective of this monotropism, this tendency to be really deeply focused or hyper-focused in flow states that can be very nourishing. And so to pull out of that can be a little bit harder. And this can result in something called a monotropic split. Oh, and before I continue, so just as an interesting sidebar, monotropism was not coined by Murray, who wrote the 2018 article, but that Murray's mother. So that Murray's article I did not cite, but this information and these quotes are from Offspring Murray's article, so to speak. So I just wanted to name that. So this is also from Offspring Murray's article. Monotropic split is when a monotropic person has to function in a polytropic world, basically, where I have to divide my attention amongst many competing demands. And there can be difficulty with the splitting of the focus. And so for a monotropic person to have to split their attention results in having to split already dwindled resources towards something else when there isn't. And it results in a fair amount of overriding, and it's not sustainable. And so there can be, with this sort of monotropic living in a polytropic world problem, some irritability, impatience, edgy anxiety and frustration type feelings and sensations that start to show up as a result of having had to yank whatever, or sort of grab or claw back some of what has been dedicated over here to over here. And it can be very uncomfortable to do that. And there can be a sign of overwhelm as a result of having to operate in a capacity that doesn't quite match the style or the monotropism of the individual. And having to operate in a polytropic way where I'm having to dedicate resources to many, 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 many different things can result in what we might call meltdowns, where there's a lot of just activation and overwhelm or shutting down, or burnout or mental health crises for neurodivergent folks, and can be one of the causes. There are many of what we might call, again, demand avoidance, where the demand avoidance is the way of just tolerating all of this. It's like, I can't take on more demand, and so I'm just going to not go there. PDA is a bit broader than that, and I can share some resources about that separately, which, again, the terminology for that is starting to be called pervasive demand avoidance, but can also be reworded as a persistent drive for autonomy. And with so many neurodivergent people not having had autonomy or agency or a voice, this piece around difficulty with splitting attention across tasks is even more important to understand. Autistic burnout can occur, of course, as a result of all these things. Because autistic folks especially are often perceiving layers of nuance and patterns and details that others miss. ADHD has a bit of this as well, especially with sometimes the hyperfocus and the detail orientation for certain areas of interest. But especially with autism, there can be this ability to really perceive pattern. There's a regular tendency to be misunderstood, misjudged, and scapegoated, whether it has to do with, and the best example I will give, just so we can move along, is almost like you've got a map. And as the neurodivergent person, you're trying to drop the pin on the map about what you're noticing and picking up on or what you're experiencing. And the misattunement comes from the outside, where the person isn't able to pick up what you're putting down, so to speak, right? They're not getting it. Either their interoception is different, or they're not aware of that layer, or it has to do with a power imbalance with regards to the other person. And what can happen is that there's there can be misperceptions, being misunderstood, not quite getting it, having to excessively explain over and over again what you're trying to say, having words put in your mouth because of what the other person's misinterpretation is of the very specific nuance that you're trying to name. And you can be scapegoated. There can be blame shifting around if there's any shame in the listener of the neurodivergent person, especially if that person's neurotypical, a tendency to blame shift and go, well, you're like this, therefore this is a you problem. In reality, it's like, well, no, actually, I'm picking up on something and you don't have the capacity to sit with it just yet. And you don't want to name that because of your core shame. And I'm seeing all this as the autistic person, but I can't speak it because you've got the power, and I'm just going to get basically, shot as the messenger. So I have to do all this sort of emotional labor around how to just be in relationship. And that's exhausting. The number of layers of navigating awareness of nuance and pattern, and not having that shared by the individuals that you're trying to be in connection with, and then having that result in difficulty, is really hard. And so you're having to allocate whatever dwindling resources you have towards navigating these dynamics, plus trying to attend to the polytropic demands or especially low dopamine tasks if you're ADHD. And if you don't have enough time or space to recover between switching tasks, this is a really strong recipe for autistic burnout. And it speaks a little bit to spoon theory, which comes out of the disability movement. And the original person who created it really just came out of a cool conversation around the metaphor of having fewer spoons than the average individual. So the person was talking about their experience of chronic illness and having an autoimmune issue. And, if you wake up with a certain number of spoons, basically, spoons represent the amount of energy that you've got to get through your day. And depending on what's going on, the amount of demand, the amount of additional stacked variables that you're having to contend with, whether that's within your own health symptoms, your own traits, or the outside world, you're going to have fewer and fewer spoons, quote unquote, available to cope with the demands. And so demand avoidance can reflect the lack of spoons that can happen for individuals who have various disabilities or chronic illness or complex syndromes, if we think of our syndromal material from the advanced level of SE training. And so autistic burnout or neurodivergent burnout can be one example of where spoon theory comes into play. And a particular feature of lacking spoons, for instance, or burnout would be what Adkin and Gray Hammond call meerkat mode. So this is where an overwhelmed, and I'll just read the quote, an overwhelmed monotropic person is really, really, really seeking to find a monotropic flow state again. They're looking to be able to remove all this excess and come back into a state of coherence, to use SE language. They're looking to find that flow. And so any kind of hypervigilance around, I'm looking not just for the dangers and the exits and what's going to protect me, but I'm looking for flow. I'm looking for that state where I feel most like myself. And when I can't find that because of the demands and being a square peg in a round neurotypical hole, I'm going to be really overwhelmed. And there can be dysregulation associated with that. And a tendency to loop and avoid demands and stand and stare and buffer and go, I'm so overwhelmed. I just want to find my flow, but I can't because I've got all these things I need to do and I'm completely hampered. Just the executive dysfunction that accompanies this is quite can be quite disabling. And so meerkat mode is that place where I'm like literally frozen in arrest, looking for, okay, how do I get back to this coherent state where I feel more connected to what we call again that neurodivergent wellness, right? How do I come back to that? And so I'm gonna, before I jump into considerations for SE practice, I'm gonna pull up the chat because I did notice there was a couple of new things that came in. So there's a lot of things here. A lot of things have come in as direct messages to me. So thank you everybody for your kind thoughts. I won't have a chance to obviously address all of your direct messages, but I do really appreciate the time you've taken to articulate some of your observations and that this is really resonating for you. So one question that has come in is from further back, and I am going to name this one because I think it's helpful, is how do we avoid inspiration porn? So part of it is going to be recognizing for us our own ableism and our own privilege. And for those of you who recognize or operate from a social justice perspective, recognizing our privilege is a really good practice and a really important one if we're going to serve the populations that we serve. In general, any marginalized population, and because this is like a little focus group topic on neurodivergence specifically as one of many marginalized groups, avoiding inspiration porn with this population would be recognizing my own tendency to have my own privilege that I might not recognize. We all have it. Privilege doesn't make you a bad person, right? Having privilege just means that there are certain experiences that you get to have and don't have to face in the world by virtue of the physicality you were born into. And you're not a bad person for having had the body that you got. This isn't always necessarily chosen. Right? The features that we have to live with are not necessarily consciously picked, like I don't get to change some of these things per se, or I didn't get them because of merit, right? It's just recognizing that, oh, okay, yeah, by virtue of my own experiences and what I do and do not have to face in the world, there may be things I'm not aware of, right? And how do I become more aware of that? So when you see something like an inspirational story, it's not that it's not on some level inspiring, but what if you have more power and you're coming in as the, oh, look at me, I'm this able-bodied person, and wow, look at this amazing person with Down syndrome who overcame this, so to speak, or what have you. It's not wrong to feel inspired by that, but it's like, can we take it a step further? Not just, oh, wow, that makes me feel better. If they can do it, I can, and then I quietly go on my day. It's like, well, what are we doing to actually shift the system so that folks who are marginalized are not having to face as many difficulties in the first place, which provides us with inspiration porn, right? Like, what can I do as the person who has a bit more power and privilege to address those conditions that are filling my news feed with beautiful inspiration porn stories, right? So it's not that they're not inspiring. Certainly, overcoming adversity is important. We all have to do it in life. Sure, that's fair. But there's a deeper layer here around, well, what conditions is a neurodivergent person having to face by virtue of living in an ableist society? And am I participating in that? And how can I help dismantle that? That would be an example of quote unquote avoiding inspiration porn. So it's not avoiding it per se, like, oh, how do I remove it from my news feed on Facebook, right? It's more about recognizing, how am I using it? What is this reflecting? What's the story beneath the story, right? And what can I do to help set different conditions, right? So that these folks can feel safer. So I just wanted to say that. And so that is, that's just an important piece. So there's a lot of other comments here. Of course, I'm not going to have a chance to read or address them all. There are far too many that have come in, but I just did a quick scroll. Thank you all for your additional reflections. Obviously, this is a very nuanced topic, and there's way more to this subject than we're going to have time for. So please bear with me if I don't mention something or don't address something. It's not necessarily because I'm deliberately not wanting to acknowledge it, but more that it's just for time. Okay, so thank you for that. So some considerations for SE practice as I think about us as SE students or SEPs or faculty is how we hold space as a practitioner, first off. Right? So this sort of answers that question that had come in around inspiration porn. But this idea around how do we acknowledge our implicit biases and our ableism and all the other isms that, we may be having to, we may not be aware of, or that we may benefit from involuntarily. Basically, how do we recognize where we have bias, what our stereotypes are that we carry about certain populations? The ableism that might color how I apply SE, and some of these next slides get into a little bit of that. And it can be really subtle. And also just recognizing my own privilege. Again, it's not about inducing shame. It's just, we've all got it. Even myself as a multiply neurodivergent individual who really struggles sometimes, I also have privilege, right? I have trauma and I have privilege. I'm a white, thin-bodied, well-educated, cisgendered female in North America. I've got a fair amount of privilege. And I have difficulty. I have a lot of complex syndromes. Multiple layers of neurodivergence and executive dysfunction that comes from that, which I find very hampering sometimes, while also having superpowers can be a lot of fun. There's things about it that I really love and appreciate, and there's things that are really challenging, right? I can have those challenges and have chronic health issues and complexity and have privilege, right? So how am I recognizing that? How do we hold the yes and, not the either or? So starting to get curious about some of that is going to be really essential. We want to address and anticipate any potential mismatches or misattunements between neurodivergent and neurotypical practitioner and client combos, whether that's during practice rounds in SE training or in our respective professional spheres, by priming the pump. And that's a term Ableist uses that I really like. And this is this idea of speaking to it up front. And so naming, if you are, say, a neurodivergent practitioner, naming that up front, here's what you might see. You might find that I have difficulty switching focus at times, or I might be a little bit, edgy or irritable in one moment, or lack patience here, and this is what's going on for me. And then how are we going to repair that if that happens, right? It's not intended to be countertransference towards you as my client because I'm annoyed by something that you've said, or I'm trying to scold you or be arrogant or harmful. I'm not trying to be that way, but it's just part of my own neurodivergent monotropism, for instance, right? So there might need to be education if you, as the helper, so to speak, are neurodivergent, especially if you have a neurotypical client who might not understand what that is and maybe more susceptible to misunderstanding or experiencing the neurodivergence in a way that is judged or criticized in some way, and vice versa. If you're a neurotypical practitioner, how are you priming the pump by speaking to this with a neurodivergent client and expressing, what you're going to be doing in order to hold space for that individual? Differences in capacity can also occur if there is neurodivergence or neurotypical pairings happening in the course of the work. And so what is the capacity of the practitioner? And we talk about that in SE training all the time, don't we? Is my capacity as the practitioner, is my ability to sit with what's coming up in the client, if it's small, I might inadvertently intervene in a way that shuts down something that's happening in the client that's actually wanting to move through, because I may have activation around the thing that's coming up. This is that idea of somatic countertransference, so to speak, towards what's coming up for the client or the lender, so to speak, in our practice rounds. So watching for myself as what my own capacity might be, and how do I start to recognize that and work with that? And that will become a little bit more evident in another slide as I get a little bit further along. So you want to recognize that there can be management strategies that are related to social survival. Now, we have this with regular developmental trauma, regular quote unquote developmental trauma, but there can be masking and appeasement that occur as management strategies or social survival, occurring, the fawn response, so to speak, and other versions of appeasement showing up in the relationship that may not be caught right away. The masking and the appeasement for some neurodivergent people has gotten so good and so convincing that that's what allows them to survive, right? So if we're fooled by the presentation or we're fooled by the physiology, that just speaks to the degree to which the individual doesn't feel safe or hasn't felt safe in the world, right? So it's not about necessarily dismantling that, but about really acknowledging that there's a power differential, a power dynamic at play when you're holding space as a practitioner with neurodivergent or any other marginalized population. There will be trauma experienced by the neurodivergent population as a result of helpers because of what can happen. So recognizing that you might hold a safe space or think you're holding a safe space, but that individual will be wary and will mask and appease potentially. There can be reenactments and binds as a result. So just be mindful of that. Relational and boundary rupture and repair, like we kind of play around with in SE, is going to be really essential, both because of, let's say you are a neurotypical practitioner and you miss something or you intervene in a way that causes a rupture. And how are we attending to that to support more earned security in the relationship with the practitioner who might be neurotypical? But it can also happen in the reverse, where the neurodivergent practitioner, by virtue of maybe inattention, let's say you're ADHD and you have a moment of inattention and your mind goes whee all the way over there, and it's not because of something the client said, it's not your own countertransference. It could be, right? It could be that just before you went away, something was coming up for the client and your coping mechanism is to disconnect as opposed to join, right? Merging disconnection and joining from our SE training, those of you who remember that. So if your tendency is to disconnect and use your ADHD, like that ADHD inattention becomes almost co-opted in service of managing the somatic countertransference that's coming up, recognize that. But it can also be about, regardless of what the cause is, especially if it's just strict ADHD inattention and a tendency to go over here, that may be experienced by a neurotypical client or a neurodivergent client as a rupture, right? You misattuned, you disconnected, you were no longer present with me. And so these are not things that we necessarily do on purpose. Again, this isn't coming from a place of intentional harm, but these things can occur. So we want to recognize that. We want to support self-determination and agency for the neurodivergent client wherever possible. So that means remembering that for many folks, especially autistic, that the choice around what the focus is on in therapy often was dictated. And which is really fascinating because therapy is usually supposed to be about what the client wants. And so many autistic people have gone to therapy and the therapy has been about making them change a behavior in order to be something different, in order to fit in a different way. And sometimes people will call that kind of perspective of therapy sort of autistic conversion therapy. Not that behavior shaping can't be helpful. There's places where that can be useful, but the trouble is that it's often applied in this other way. And so if an autistic person, especially if they were early diagnosed, not so much the case with late diagnosis, of course, because they bypassed all of that usually, but they had other problems. They weren't caught. And so often other labels are applied, if ADHD and autism are not caught early on, or identified early on, so to speak. But who determines what the focus is of the work, right? So an example would be neurodivergent client is struggling with panic attacks, and the panic is getting to be so great that they are scratching themselves to the point of bleeding and causing a lot of harm in order to get through or cope with the panic attacks. And the neurodivergent person says, well, I really want to work on this thing that I do, this scratching thing that I do, because it's really starting to cause me physical harm. And the clinician says, well, no, we should work on the panic, because the panic is really a concern for me, because you shouldn't be that anxious all the time. So who gets to determine the focus? And so for the neurodivergent person, it's like, well, actually, what's more of an issue for me is not that I can't sit with my own affect. I can sit with my anxiety. The issue for me is that there's something coming before this thing. And I've had a neurodivergent friend of mine share about this exact experience where it's like, oh, like I have this thing that I do and it's actually starting to cause me harm. I want to be able to deal with this. The anxiety or the things that are causing anxiety, all that kind of stuff, that's, that's something else, but I really want to work here, which, as we know in SE, is some of the prodromal work. So, so just before you notice yourself go to scratch, what are you starting to notice? And let's work from there as opposed to further along the chain. But if we come from a perspective that is more ableist and, non-listening of autistic voices or neurodivergent voices, we might impose what we think is the issue and not hear what the client thinks is the issue or wants to work on first. So we really want to be careful of that agency and voice piece with working in this capacity. Or for instance, who determines what is the trauma vortex and what is the counter vortex? Or what is a management strategy and what is counter vortex, for instance, for a neurodivergent person, right? Who gets to dictate that or determine that? Is that the neurotypical person, right? And so we really want to be really curious about whether our perspective is limited in some way and may actually result in challenges for the client. And again, who determines what the goal is? Now, we may have impressions because of the maps that we carry in the work and the knowledge that we have around the nervous system, that we may have ideas around what those goals could be. But this is where the informed consent and the anticipatory pieces are so essential. So maybe running the idea by the person going, hey, I'm wondering about this. As you hear me talk about this as an idea, what are you noticing happen inside? Right. So we're always really making sure that we're running stuff by. We're not coming from this top down, I'm the expert position. So it's really essential, especially with the neurodivergent population, especially given the trauma that has occurred with helpers. And we want to, a great example of this would be watching for implicit messaging. Is the goal of the intervention to, on some subtle level, make them less neurodivergent? If that's the case, we want to check our ableism, right? Because there is a lot of idea that, oh, this is something to be eradicated, as opposed to going, these are normal variations within a normal population. The population skew is actually quite broad, and these are normal reflections within a normal population. And how are we helping to recognize that, as opposed to taking what's typical as a narrow slice of that curve and blasting that as and making that the norm or the benchmark? Right. So we want to be really, really clear if we're using SE or something like the Safe and Sound protocol, which can be helpful with neurodivergent populations, certainly people with sensory processing difficulties, with trauma, with emotion dysregulation, difficulty with social engagement. Is this about, again, supporting the client's goal? Or is the implicit message about, I'm going to give you more social engagement capacity so that you can be more neurotypical, right? Watching the implied meaning making or messaging behind how we introduce something is going to be really essential. Next piece, sideband and coupling. So we want to get really curious about if something that's presenting itself is neurodivergent trauma or other traumas, or if it's neurodivergent trait, or if it's personality, temperament, or some combination. Because we can sometimes, I think, when we're doing SC, like everything's a nail and we're going to hit everything with a hammer because we assume everything's a nail, right? And so it's trauma, it's trauma, it's trauma, it's trauma, it's this. And we're looking at everything through that lens. But in reality, there can be other things or other explanations for what is going on. And I'll give some examples of what I mean. So a common one that comes up is the meaning channel with neurodivergent folks. So in hyperfocus, there can be a tendency to shut out other stimuli and be in the really wonderful flow state. In hyperfocus, there can also be info dumping. And the info dumping can really involve a lot of meaning making, a lot of reporting of verbal narrative, right? And as we saw with some neurodivergent people, hyperverbal is sometimes associated with ADHD, right? So one of the things that can happen is that obviously meaning making channel as a skill set for neurodivergent population isn't always evidence of a management strategy, as in going into my head in order to stay away from something else, which is common with M from SciBAM, or a lack of capacity for something else. Like I go here because I can't be with the undercoupled sensation that accompanies the verbal story. So I'm just going to hang out up here, and it's a capacity question. It could be, certainly, it absolutely could be, but not always. So we don't want to necessarily jump to that conclusion. So for instance, in this presentation, I've been in hyperfocus. I feel a sense of flow. I'm in my element. I'm dumping a bunch of information at all of you. I can't titrate it particularly well because there are how many people? There were up to about 290 something a while ago. We have over 1,000 people registered for this webinar. Not everyone is able to attend live. So most people are going to be watching by video. But for the group of people who are here, I'm not going to be able to attune perfectly to everybody's capacity for speed, information, etc. It's just an impossibility. But that doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the fact that each of you, each of the currently, right now, we're sitting at 183, each of you is having a different experience to what I'm sharing. I hold that reality in my mind and I go, okay, I recognize that you all have your own SciBAMs for this. And you all may be in various places in the activation and deactivation cycle. I'm aware of my own body as I'm very much in meaning making. I'm very much also coupled to my sensations, my posture, my gestures, my pacing, any feelings that I'm having right now, right? So I'm not undercoupled to sensation while I'm in this flow, right? But there can be a tendency to assume that, especially if there's a lot of info dump. So it's important to recognize that that may not be true, but it could be true. So you want to check it out. Sharing relatable stories, which often happens with neurodivergent folks, is a way that neurodivergent people express empathy, which often will be the image and the meaning-making channels. And so when someone shares something difficult that happened for them, often it's not uncommon for a neurodivergent person to share a similar story, not because they want to take over or want to necessarily take the attention away or to make something go away, but because it's how they're sharing empathy, right? And so if that happens and you're the practitioner and you're neurodivergent and your impulse might be to share a story in response, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But if you're neurotypical or you're neurodivergent, and really what you just want in that moment is for someone to attune to what you're experiencing and not share their story, then as the neurodivergent practitioner, we're going to want to really hold a lot more intentionality around when we're sharing the relatable story, right? So it's not necessarily taking someone out of their experience, and that it's actually enhancing or providing more of that empathic resonance counter vortex in order to be able to be with the trauma vortex. And if it's the client who is neurodivergent and shares relatable stories as a way of demonstrating their awareness of something, and they're using the meaning making to demonstrate awareness of a sensation, for instance, again, it may not necessarily be that they're undercoupled to sensation. Okay, so it might be that you're working a bit harder for them to get to the sensation or to track it, but recognize that that can be normal. Info dumping and hyperverbal sort of qualities can be there's a neurodivergent love languages thing that's been going around the internet, which is rather sweet. And it reframes the love languages. And one of them is info dumping. And it's really helpful to view it as, hey, I'm doing this to be helpful. This is something I really love. And I'm letting you into my hyper focus. I'm letting you into my flow state so we can vibe together, basically. And it's my invitation or my bid for connection, but it's also me wanting to support you with information. I have all these knowledge bits and you might find this helpful. Right. And so it can be coming from this place of an attempt at attunement or an attempt at help. Again, could be misplaced. Again, if what's wanting to happen is actually tracking through something else, but recognizing that it's not necessarily pathologizing. Right. And so it's also important not to label that as seeking attention or wanting to impress or having a sense of self-importance. Right. And it can also be a reflection of awareness of multiple CYBAM layers. Sometimes the info dumping can actually be that the person is actually aware of all the layers and is feeling urgency to try to report on all of them, right? Because of their great detail and pattern recognition. So recognize that that could also be a feature as well. And then that can actually be overwhelming, is the trying to convey all of that, especially if they've been misunderstood and misjudged. And it could be a management strategy. It really could. Right. So I'm not saying that it's not, but recognize that there's particular flavors of this with neurodivergence, right? The other pieces to this is that shifting between CYBAM channels can be more challenging because of monotropism. So that difficulty with changing channels because of hyperfocus and flow and where I place my resources can also be another thing that makes it difficult to go, oh, so as you're telling me about this, I'm curious what you're noticing on the inside, because maybe there's something else in the story that wants to happen, the body story, for instance, right? And so in our best attempt at being good slider inners of SE in the meaning making to try to invite awareness of sensation or behavior that wants to happen, you know, there may be irritability in the client at having been interrupted. There can be difficulty with it, a tendency to just keep bulldozing, right? And there can be collisions in the conversation as a result of that. That can also occur as a result of executive dysfunction and just difficulty with managing these various things, or difficulty with memory, which makes the image channel sometimes challenging, or organizing thoughts can make it challenging as well. Again, what we talked about, differences in interoception, or it could be a trauma response, 100%. Right? So we want to widen the possibilities as to what the difficulty in shifting channels might actually reflect, or some combination, of course, of all of the above. If you're sliding in as an SE person into your lender's experience as in a practice round, for instance, or with your client, the sliding in can be experienced by a neurodivergent person as you're too much. Right. And with neurodivergence, the message is always, you're too much or not enough. Your intensity is too much for me. You're too intense in your nuances and how much you pick up on and how much you know and how much you share and how fast you talk and how big your feelings are. Right. There's often that. And you're not enough of this other thing, this neurotypical way, or this other thing, whatever that other thing happens to be. And so the sliding in needs to be handled in a particular way. So priming the pump, again, can be really helpful. Like, hey, in our work together, you may see me from time to time slide in when you're mid-info dump or when you're in hyperfocus, because there's something in the story that seems really important to me that I really want to make sure we're not forgetting or that we're not missing, right? It's about adding to the voice, not silencing the voice, right? There's other aspects to the story that also may want to have a voice that I'm curious about. So we're priming the pump, right? Like, as you hear me say that I might slide in from time to time, which I know might result in irritability for you or difficulty for you. Can we, there's some sound happening. Hosts, can we make sure the audio is muted? Thank you. When there's that, we might have to prime the pump and say, as you hear me say that I might slide in from time to time, because this is some of the ways that I work, what do you notice happens, right? And then we can track with that, right? So there can be core shame a lot with this population as a result of the ableism. Power dynamics, again, just we want to recognize that. So the sliding in of the SE person can be experienced as yet another intrusion, right? Or someone taking over control from me. And my demand avoidance might be my drive for autonomy, right? So I don't want you to do that, back off. I need you to hold space. I just need to be myself for a bit before you start to slide in. And that can be needed before we start to weave in a little bit more of the intentionality that we hold with SE. Even if the SE will be potentially very helpful, we got to be very careful about the nuances. Interestingly, with neurodivergent populations, this is a term I've coined myself, so thwarted flow, because for most of my life, I've wondered why irritability and frustration have become my friends, and they're a very classic state for me to be in. And I have a memory even of the earliest time I can recall thwarted flow. And we talk about thwarted fight or flight, getting stuck in freeze. And in recent iterations of SE, we talk about relational renegotiation or dyadic completion, not just biological, but how are we supporting coming back into the felt sense of safety with one another, into quiescent immobility where we're in each other's presence and there's co-regulation and it feels safe to be together, which I've been calling thwarted find, the find response of orienting to the other and being met with attunement, and care and not abuse or neglect or what have you. And thwarted flow is another one that I've kind of coined that I really like, which is this neurodivergent experience of having that hyperfocus flow state interrupted by polytropic demands or by a misattuned neurotypical person or by what have you. And it's so difficult sometimes to come back to the flow because of the executive dysfunction, not being able to organize time properly, difficulty with managing demands, all these different things. It's so hard to find flow that when you're in it, it's really hard to be interrupted from it because it feels so good when you're there because it's so hard to get to and it's so effortful to get to. And so there can be an experience of boundary rupture when there's a sliding in by an SEP that will be experienced as thwarted flow. And then how do we work with that, right? So it's because the interruptions or the sliding in by the SE person are absolutely helpful, right? And you have to get to a place where the two can be true, right? Being able to tolerate and work through the thwarted flow, but also recognizing how do we set it up so that we're priming for the preparation of that. And restoring that so it's not just experienced as another boundary rupture. We want to, sort of the sliding in by the SCP can also end up reinforcing a neuroception of unsafety in relationship as a result of these various things. And again, not intentionally. And we also want to be careful about, is the intervention that I'm doing as an SE person reflecting my capacity or container or theirs? So this is a typical question in general, but it can be especially true with neurodivergent clients. So neurodivergent clients, for instance, often are labeled as intense. Now, that can be reflective of dysregulation, certainly. And sometimes it's also reflective of a greater capacity for aliveness. Right? There's so much aliveness. And often with other neurodivergent people, there's quite an okayness around that aliveness, although there can be mismatches between neurodivergent folks. I think of sometimes myself with my stepkids where their big aliveness is loud and I'm in stimulation overwhelm. And I'm just like, I love your aliveness. And right now it's just a lot. So I'm going to put in some ear defender type things because it's just, I don't want to necessarily always invite you to be, modulating your arousal level because of my overstimulation, right? So there's going to be recognizing, is my capacity impeding in some way the experience of the other as the helper? So is my intervention coming in to try to regulate somebody actually interfering with their felt sense of coherence and aliveness? And how do we support the embodiment of that, as well as my capacity to recognize there may be a container difference because I'm neurotypical, and the container is going to be different because of the differences in interoception and neuroception and exteroception in a neurodivergent person. So we want to hold that in awareness as well. So additional pieces before we wrap up for today. Global high intensity activation and syndromal. So these are again categories. If you're not SE trained, this will be a little bit over your heads perhaps. So I'm speaking really specifically to the SE audience here. Global high intensity activation can absolutely be related to trauma, but can also be related to sensory overwhelm and stimulus stacking, to use the terminology that I like to use. So we can see this with and you might still intervene in the same way because the sensory overwhelm can be the cause of the global high, not just trauma patterning, right? So it's important to recognize that can be the thing. And we want to recognize, is the meltdown or shutdown that's happening or the activation that's happening and the overwhelm that's happening and the big expression that's wanting to move, is that reflective of lack of regulation or lack of capacity? Or is it a sign of having bigger aliveness and having coped for too long? Could be both, or all of the above, or elements of all of the above. So this is again about not wanting to jump to conclusions necessarily, but holding that awareness, right? If the nervous system's been coping for too long and holding a lot of nuance and has a lot of capacity for all the things that they have to be aware of in the world, either because of not feeling safe in the world and or because of their own ability to notice detail and nuance and layers and patterns, there comes a point where that can become too much. And so I think neurodivergent folks, there can be that pattern, that possibility that I'm overwhelmed by my own ability to notice SIBAM. And so how do we start to work with that, right? So just hold that in awareness. It might be extreme overcoupling, but not necessarily that there's undercoupling. It's just, maybe I'm just really coupled. I'm very aware of all the things and it's too much. Hyper awareness can be overwhelming to sift through. So may need help to titrate that. Again, could be hypervigilance, but might not be. There can be many comorbidities with neurodivergence. So with autism, with ADHD, there's often a lot of like a litany of other alphabet soup diagnoses that can accompany that. So recognize that the advanced level SE material can be very helpful, especially the prodromal and coherence work. And so if you're working with neurodivergent folks, because of the complex health syndromes, we're wanting to recognize that there can be a lot of mismatches, like for instance, ADHD, a tendency to go really fast, but having a nervous system that's in chronic fatigue. You can see these sort of mismatches that can occur. So it can be helpful to notice the sequences leading to the management strategies, but also not assume something is necessarily a management strategy that should be dismantled, quote unquote. Management strategies can be very helpful, as we know, right? So there's a place for those. And I think there's just a need to be really nuanced around how we're working with those. So the example of, my friend with I'm having a panic attack and I'm scratching myself into oblivion here. I'd like to work with the thing happening before the scratching versus, how do I cope with anxiety in my life? Like let's work over here, please, or let's get you medicated. Like let's maybe all these things are helpful, but we want to kind of be really curious. And the prodromal work in SE can be very helpful to figuring out, is this trauma? Is this neurodivergent trait? Is it some combination where my neurodivergent trait has now been co-opted into a management strategy to manage trauma? Like I'm really good at noticing patterns because I'm neurodivergent, and that has really served me well in terms of being hypervigilant. And I can't tell the difference between when I'm in regular pattern recognition and when I'm hypervigilant anymore. When is it exploratory orienting or defensive orienting? How can I tell? Sometimes the prodromal work becomes interesting. Also, just before that shows up, what did you notice? Right? To start to help with teasing apart or differentiating what some of these things are, right? Finding the signal in the noise. We want to also help, this prodromal work can also help with not just managing overwhelm, but also impulses, and impulse control can be a challenge. And recognizing that neurodivergent traits that we may misinterpret as pathology, right, can actually be a gateway into the felt sense of coherence. So when you're in flow, when you're in hyperfocus, when you're in info dump, or what have you, as examples, for instance, what happens in your body, right? What do you notice that's like? And then expanding on that. And that can be a really beautiful way to counter the shame of being neurodivergent. So recognizing some of that can be really helpful. For late discovery of neurodivergence, for people who sort of either self-identified in later adulthood or who were diagnosed in later adulthood, psychoeducation can be really helpful. This is true of any trauma client. Sometimes psychoeducation around the SE model, what to expect, here's what you might see me do, working with anticipatory charge around some of the work you might be doing or inviting, as well as information about neurodivergence can be very helpful as well, and that may be necessary or required. So this is where meaning making can be very helpful in some cases. And then you can obviously weave in other side-end elements from there. Working with parents, caregivers, and partners of neurodivergent folks also will carry its own particular challenges, especially if there is unidentified neurodivergence in the parents or caregivers, and the child or offspring or youth in care has become the identified patient. And so there can be a lot of internalized ableism in the caregiving system and in other providers, or even in partners. So we want to make sure that we're aware of some of these layers. Couples work with neurodivergent people has its own set of considerations. So it's important to recognize that, as well as this thing of what I sometimes call the supremacy of the ventral vagus, and is called out within the autistic community. I think Holly Bridges is one of the folks who is polyvagal theory trained, but really speaks about this idea of how the social engagement system isn't always the be all and end all, especially for neurodivergent folks. And so making someone more socially engaged may not always be the focus. So we want to make sure that we're holding that in awareness as well. Just like the supremacy of calm that happens in SE sometimes is we're always aiming to, are we aiming to downregulate, or, you know, or are we supporting more capacity in the nervous system to be with fluctuating experiences of aliveness, right? How can you tell if the aliveness of a neurodivergent person is over threshold and dysregulated, or is actually very embodied? These are really helpful distinctions to get curious about, and, you know, starting to see which one it might be and where we might help from. There can be double binds with fight response mobilization. So I'm just about finished. So if you need to take off, that's totally fine. I'll just take these final few moments to name these additional nuances, and we'll be wrapping up very shortly. Double binds with fight response mobilizing. So when you're doing really great, you know, work with the fight response that maybe didn't get to happen, the person couldn't have a voice, working with finding the boundary, working with the no, all this classic stuff we do in SE, we want to be really careful about the context of the individual. So especially if they're autistic or ADHD, in particular with autism, but can also happen for ADHD, if we're working with the no and the fight response, and an individual wants to not take a particular medication because of intolerable side effects, because their sensory and interoception is very different, and they start to come into that no, it is often common in the medical industry to deem someone who doesn't want to take their medication as non-compliant, or I think of ADHD oppositional defiant, and institutionalize them against their will in order to make them take the medication. So sometimes that's done out of a desire to want to be helpful and not harmful, right? And there can be, again, an assumption of incompetence and a tendency to infantilize autistic folks. So it's really, really important to watch when we're working with fight response or supporting the no, are they in a system or surrounded by other professionals and other parties who will not pathologize the no that you're helping them to mobilize and work through, right? So being careful about navigating those layers can be really important. Neurodivergent clients don't always have the same experience of safety in the world as neurotypical folks. And so we don't want to take that for granted that, oh, this is really great fight response work, right? And you might want to also consider about working with what's behind the fight response. So sometimes there can actually be the fight response renegotiation. If the fight is actually looping a lot, it can actually be the thing that we don't need to be working with. It might be the thing that's behind the fight. So fight can become a management strategy for what's underneath it. And with ADHD, there's something called low arousal theory. There's many theories of ADHD and autism. We don't have time for that. But with ADHD, there's a theory of low arousal that the hyperactivity and impulse control issues reflect difficulty with regulating of certain neurochemicals, of course, but also that there's a tendency to try to lift up and out of hypoarousal on the low end of the window of tolerance and overshoot and wind up into hyper. And so it can be really helpful to see if there's anything related to undercoupled hypoarousal that needs to be worked with to support more capacity to not have to necessarily go into hyper. But that's a that's a iffy question. So it's one of those ones just to be curious about. We want to also recognize that, again, with fight response mobilization, or thwarted flow, as I'm calling it, is what's behind this could be the conditions. So there could be systemic conditions that need to be addressed. So trauma recovery, I think, unfortunately, is often perceived as an inside job. Let's just help you regulate, right? Let's help you shift your nervous system experience. That's valuable, right? And SE is brilliant at that. And sometimes in this, we can forget that there's also the external stuff that needs to happen as well. And so SE, as some of you know, is based in ethology. So Peter Levine grounded SE in this perspective of ethology, which is the studying of organisms under their optimal conditions, right? And in the wild, the classic example is animals don't walk around with PTSD and trauma, right? They're able to move through their responses and come back out the other side and complete the things that need to be completed and thaw out or freeze and deactivate. And we have the discharge of all that built up energy that had nowhere to go, and that restores allostasis, right? The ability to have prediction and meeting the demand that's necessary for the demand at hand. And ethology implies that the conditions need to be right to support this to happen. And we spend a lot of time in SE with this. You know, how are we setting those conditions around attunement, proxemics, et cetera? And we're so careful about that. But ethology also implies that the greater conditions also need to be supportive of this. So if I'm working with someone with trauma and they're a marginalized population facing various systemic injustices, and we do the work in our office and we help their nervous system regulate, but they go back out into the world and the world is actually a very dangerous place that will harm them or kill them, it doesn't matter how much internal work I support them to do, we're going to keep having the same activation and shutdown responses because the world isn't safe. Animals in the wild are able to discharge and deactivate because the conditions are different. The conditions for attachment are different. The conditions of social connection are different. Problems are short-term in the wild, right? Risks and threats are short-term. They pass. We mobilize, we activate, we deactivate. Captivity conditions are where we start to see more trauma. And this is why SE exists, is how do we set conditions to help support the renegotiation? So what systemic conditions need to change to support neurodivergent people and other marginalized populations to have more felt sense of safety in the world so that their nervous system can actually express and explain or experience rather sustainable physiology, right? So it's the two. Right? We're working on an inside job level of helping this repattern, but also what needs to change on the outside. And so SE by its very nature is a social justice oriented, can be a social justice oriented model, right? Because it's ethology based, and ethology is all about the conditions and how are we supporting the conditions for these various marginalized groups, right? How are we addressing that? That's literally the focus of ethology. Is those conditions, and what are the optimal ones that support something to be different. And so as a result of that, SE can absolutely be used in this perspective, right? So we just need to hold that as the additional layer. And of course, we need to titrate how much titration is tolerable. And this is where I'll leave you on, is an individual might live up here or live down here who's neurodivergent. And this is true of all trauma. And we may have to titrate how much they can come into something that isn't this or this. And that's not an unusual thing, right? To be able to come back into more exploratory orienting, that pattern of being somewhere in hyper or hypo may look a little different. And the window size to be in neither may look different from a neurotypical person. It doesn't mean that we can't work on slowly growing some of that window a little bit more, in and out of hyper, in and out of hypo. It may never look like a neurotypical person's, but we want to titrate how much of that titration is possible and where we're starting from. So you might ask a sensation question, they respond with meaning making again. Again, is that lack of capacity or tolerance, window of tolerance for sensation, or is it any of those other things we talked about? So we really want to make sure that we're holding a lot of this with great care. And with that said, I'm going to wrap it up here. What I would suggest, just due to the interest of time, is if anyone wants to book a consult, my websites were listed on one of the earlier slides. You can contact me through any of those as well. Carolyn, I'll hand it off to you.
No, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thanks.